Hello and welcome. I'm David Robinson, the online editor at The Banker, and today we're going to talk about the all-encompassing focus on net zero emissions, which drives a lot of investment these days. With me to discuss this is Rob Harley, a portfolio manager with a sustainable funds group at Stewart Investors. Rob, welcome.
Thank you, David.
Since the 2015 Paris Agreement, an increasing number of governments have set out really ambitious targets to cut carbon dioxide emissions, and these policies underpin a lot of business strategies. You can see it everywhere, but you would argue that focusing on net zero commitments by itself as it is inadequate. Can you elaborate on that?
I think it's inadequate and probably quite problematic, and I'll say briefly why. The first problem is that to stabilize the climate, we have to work even faster than these pathways to net zero imply. In fact, we actually have to reduce overall emissions by 7% a year. And when you consider that emissions have been rising year on year for decades, that's an enormous challenge. Now, that challenge isn't made any easier by the fact that 2050 is a very distant target. And I think that focusing on a target that's so far out probably leads to deferral of action. Very few human beings are procrastinators. We put things off. So I think that we need to focus much more on the here and now. That's the first point. The second point is that we need action, and we need more emphasis on action and less on conversations about disclosure and measurement and scenarios. Many of the solutions are very clear and obvious, even to a young adolescent. So let's focus on those things, and let's focus on the action that's required. But I think we also need to be careful about what sorts of actions we take. So let's try and take the right kinds of actions. And we can touch in due course on the problems with net zero in relation to things like carbon offsets, which lead to the tail wagging the dog. And we should be focusing on the emission reductions themselves. I think there's a potential for some accounting tricks with net zero because of these. The focus is too much on the net and not enough on the zero, not enough on the emission reductions. I think that there's a problem of a potential bandwagon effect. We've had many initiatives around carbon disclosure. Financial institutions and companies have signed up to these initiatives going back to 2000, and we've seen very little good come of these initiatives. So I think the potential for negative publicity or for the wrong type of publicity, for spurious publicity, and even for deception is huge with something like net zero. So we need to be holding companies properly to account. The last point is that I think that there's a challenge here in balancing a focus, having a focus, but also not being myopic about the climate change challenge. Climate change is one of many challenges, arguably a very big challenge and an important challenge, but it's one of many challenges in the whole sphere of sustainable development. And there are links between all these different challenges that we have to try and meet. So whilst we have to really focus on the climate challenge, I think we also need to acknowledge that it goes hand in hand with a bunch of other sustainable development challenges.
Rob, briefly, if the focus on net zero by itself is inadequate, can you perhaps outline what needs to be done instead, how we should broaden our thinking?
I think the first step is probably to show a little bit more honesty and integrity about the scale of the challenge. Maybe we should all commit to signing no more grand gestural commitments on these sorts of things, and rather focus on what we're going to do to meet them. So I think we need to be as ambitious as we possibly can about that, but let's focus on the practical things, on the solutions that we have in the here and now, and not on distant technologies that are unproven. Let's not make assumptions about carbon sinks like the oceans and forests being able to take up as much carbon as they have in the past, because a lot of these things are in doubt. The second thing, and I touched on this earlier, is that I think we need to be very careful of decoupling climate change from the broader challenge of sustainable development. So there's a web of links and feedback loops between many sustainable development actions that might not seem obvious, but addressing poverty, empowering women in developing countries, all of these things contribute to helping meet the challenge of sustainable development and helping meet the climate challenge as well. So I think that we need to try and look at this in the round as well. The other thing is that I think that we need to encourage companies to use their influence across their supply chains. So not just focus on what they can do in their immediate proximate sphere of influence, but look at their supply chains and where they can encourage other stakeholders to achieve emission reductions, but also focus on trying to treat stakeholders equitably as we try and achieve this transition to a carbon constrained future.
Rob, can I just come back to the issue of carbon offsetting you mentioned earlier, and why you feel that that is so controversial?
It's controversial because the challenge here is to try and maximize the emission reductions that we can achieve for the planet as a whole. The idea of offsets is that it's supposed to be a measure that one uses to try and deal with those emissions which are very difficult to remove completely. So if we're not focusing squarely on that challenge of reducing emissions, and we're allowing things like the possibilities of carbon accounting through offsetting to draw attention away from those emission reduction challenges, we're not going to achieve what net zero is supposed to achieve, which is reducing emissions for the planet as a whole. So there's the potential for companies and organizations and even countries to go for glory, to hit their targets through emission reduction projects. But really what they're doing is helping achieve the carbon accounting that gets to that net zero by sponsoring emission reduction projects elsewhere without solving or dealing with the contribution that they have to make themselves.
Interesting. Well, Rob, thank you very much for your time today. Sustainable investing is just going to keep growing in importance, and it's a trend that we will continue monitoring closely on The Banker.